Herra jästäs, tää peli on äänekäs. Jösses. Kunnon saakeli humina. Can you be a little bit less? Thank you. Like 50% less. Siellä se humisee. Mut trivia? Oh god. Tää jotain DLCtäkin. Okay, cool. Dagon is a faithful interactive adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's work, focused on story and atmosphere. You will not find difficult choices, action sequences, or inventory management here, and movement is limited to progressing through locations along with the plot.
I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more.
During the game, you will encounter interactive elements. Some of them will allow you to continue your journey, others will reveal interesting facts about the original short story, its historical background, and the author. Some of the trivia is hidden. In order to find these secrets, focus your eyes and look for the Elder sign. Eli tommonen ihme porosarvi. You can also access all the found facts later. They will be available in the main menu. Ja mä voin liikkua.
Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death.
Morphine. Morphine entered into use in the 19th century as was routinely administered to treat severe pain during the American Civil War 1861-1865 and World War I 1914 to 1918. It was also sold without restriction until 1914. Ew. Morphine became more popular after the invention of the hypodermic syringe around 1854. Friedrich Serturner, who first isolated the substance, originally named it morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god associated with dreams. At the time when Dagon was published, morphine abuse, known as soldier disease, was already it already posed a big problem in the United States. Neat.
It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider.
Harmi, että se saa näköjään itse liikkua.
The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners.
The Huns. Hunnit. The Huns were Central Asian nomads who established a dominion in Europe and invaded the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. They were known as brutal, deadly warriors and masters of quick raids who also developed powerful composite bows, lassos, and early siege weapons. During World War I, the British used the word Hun as a synonym for German, in order to emphasize their brutality. However, the term originated when the German Emperor William II gave a speech to his troops on 27th July 1900, where they embarked to China. Should you encounter the enemy, he will be defeated. No quarter will be given. Prisoners will be not taken. Whoever falls into your hands is forfeited. Just as 1,000 years ago, the Huns under the King Attila made a name for themselves, one that even today makes them seem mighty in history and legend. May the name German be affirmed by you in such a way in China that no Chinese will ever dare again to look cross-eyed at a German. The refusal to take prisoners was a clear breach of the laws and customs of war adopted during the First Hague Convention of 1899. Sotahistoria.
So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator.
Aika helvetin villiä, että sä vaan lähdet niinku merille paatilla. Sä oot jossain sakeli avomerelle ja sä lähdet soutuveneellä menemään vähän toi. Vähän hazarditouhu. Juttuuko tää johonkin ekaa maailmansotaan? Vissiin johonkin niihin aikoihin joo.
Of the longitude, I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight.
Tässä mun pystytään tekemään tässä jotakin. Ah, I didn't see the little white spot on the moon.
The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land.
No sinänsä kun Lovecraft on kirjoittanut tarinoita muun muassa omana elinaikanaansa tuossa 1900-luvun alkupuolella, niin ei varmaan ihan hirveästi, jos halutaan sivuta Cthulhun mysteerejä silleen niin kuin realistisesti niihin tarinoihin liittyen, niin yleensä ne sijoittuu sinne 1900-luvulle. Varmaan ainoat modernit tommoset ihmeen kosmisen kauhun pelit, mitä mä osaan sanoa, on noi Jatsiin tuo Kazoo Mythos-pelisarja. Erityisesti toi The Consuming Shadow. Et nehän sijoittuu silleen niin kuin 70-luvulta eteenpäin suurin piirtein, vaikka koska se ensimmäinen Five Days a Stranger nyt tapahtukaan. Ei, kyllä se on paljon modernimpi kuin 70-luku. Mut joka tapauksessa joskus niinku 90-luvun loppu tai 1900-luvun loppua on pitkälti se pelisarja, niin se se on varmaan modernein. Eikä sekään niinku, se on vaan inspired by, ei liity suoraan Cthulhun mytokseen mitenkään, että siinä on tietysti oma mythokseensa ja omat monsterinsa ja epäpyhät jumalaansa, mutta niin kun, se on hyvin paljon Lovecraftin tarinoista ottanut inspiraatiota. Ei mulle nyt yhtäkkiä tule mitään muut mieleen.
But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awoke, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions for which innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, straining my ears as I might.
No, mä nyt vasta näen, että ihmeen kasa liikkuu tuolla.
Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue.
Cthulhun mythos on niin vahvasti sidottu 20-30-luvun menoa, että modernisoinnin sijasta on ehkä helpompaa luoda omaa kosmista kauhua tai vaan lisäillä noita vanhoja jumalia. Jep, just silleen niin kuin se Croshaw oli tehnyt siinä, sen takia se onkin Cthulhu-mythos eikä Cthulhu-mythos tai mikään muu vastaava, koska, you know, se vaan keksi omat muinaisjumalaansa sun muut reliikkinsä siihen pelimaailmaan ja teki siitä sitten tarina.
On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert.
Totta! Sucker for Love. Sehän on semmonen kasarityylinen. Se toi style siinä sun muuta, niin mä oletan, että se on niin joku 80-90-luvun meininkiä, mitä siinä pelissä eletään. Totta! Meillä on siis ainakin yksi contender, joka käyttää niin kuin jollain tavalla Lovecraftin mythosta. Siinäkin on omat jumalansa. No joo, totta. Et se on vähän tekee samaa kuin Croshaw, että se niin kuin, you know, keksii omat modernimmissa settingeissa. Et joo, ei nyt ainakaan tuu mieleen mitään. Ei ainakaan tuu yhtään mitään sellaista modernia adaptaatiota. Hei, tuo saakelin Meriwetherin Lovecraft Girls. Siinä kaikki nämä ihmeen muinaisjumalat, jotka on ihan suoraan Cthulhu ja Nyarla ja kaikki nämä. Ne on... Ne on ihan suoraan, ja se on moderni, se tarina. Sarjakuva kylläkin, mutta joka tapauksessa. Meriwetherin noi Lovecraft-mythos-sarjakuvat, niin ne on hyvin moderneja. Itse asiassa ei edes moderneja, vaan peräti tulevaisuuden dystopiaan sijoittuvia. Nyaruko Crawling with Love on kanssa tuollaista. Onko se joku manga tai joku vastaava? En ole kuullut tuollaisesta. Meriweatherillähän on siis monta sarjakuvaa, joka sijoittuu siihen samaan loreen. Sillä on tyyliin... oliko se Crawling City oli yksi ja... Olisiko se ollut ihan vaan Lovecraft Girls? Se, missä oli nimenomaan Yellow King ja muuta vastaavaa. Se on haremi-anime. Mä olen aika varma, että mä muuten tiedän yhden toisenkin animen, missä Cthulhu sun muut oli chibi-hahmoja, tai chibi-tyttöjä. En nyt muista sen nimeä, mä voin katsoa sen tämän pelin jälkeen. Muistuttakaa mua.
That night, I encamped, and on the following day still travelled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance. An intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence.
Tossa se on hyllyllä. En oo kattonut vieläkään. Lighthouse-elokuva siis.
I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me.
Ja kukaan ei nyt sano, että kannattaa katsoa. Jos se on jo tossa mun hyllyllä, niin se tarkoittaa sitä, että mä todennäköisesti katsoo sen ehkä joskus.
But I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illumine. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of only a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps, where no light had yet penetrated. All at once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself. But I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express.
Vähemmän kävelysimu ja enemmän point and click visual novel. Koska mä en muun muassa kävele tässä itse. Visual noveli on ehkä lähimpänä, mitä mä voin tätä kuvailla.
For despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound.
Storytelling methods. Dagon contains many themes and storytelling methods that Lovecraft developed in his later works, such as telling the story through carvings at the Mountains of Madness, the Nameless City, journals and character notes, the Shadow Out of Time, the Haunter of the Dark, island emerging from the ocean, the Call of Cthulhu, or fictional beings and deities based on real events and mythologies. Me Go in the Whisper of Darkness. It is also considered the origin of the popular Cthulhu mythos. Some of Lovecraft's other stories also conclude in a manner similar to Dagon, but let's skip that detail in order not to spoil the ending. Niin, mä vähän veikkaan, että nimenomaan se, koska siinä on narrator siinä tarinassa kumminkin, niin se narraatio on otettu suoraan siitä short storysta. Tästä on olemassa myös semmonen 2D-versio. Mä oon aika varma, että siinä ei oo voice actingia, että sun täytyy vaan lukea se. Mut semmonen niinku pikseligrafiikalla tehty tismalleen sama juttu, mutta vaan ilman narraatiota. Sen nimi on kanssa ihan vaan Dagon.
plainly visible across the intervening water on account of their enormous size, were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Doré. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men. Though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seem to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe. Some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born.
Milloin Cthulhu-jutut tuli mainstreamiksi, sen pelejä ja kaikkea muuta ylimääräistä alkoi tulee just niihin aikoihin? Ei nää kirjat vissi ollut kovaa huutoa sitten Mä vähän veikkaan, että videopelejä yleensäkään ei ihan hirveästi ollut silleen niinku 1900-luvun alkupuolella. Mutta jos mä voisin tehdä kauhupelin, niin millaisen mä tekisin? Toi on niin vaikea kysymys, että mä osaan vastata siihen tälleen näin niinku on the spot. '50-luvusta eteenpäin jatkuvasti suositumpaa, koska vaikutukset näkyy laajemmin. '80-luvulla kauhuleffoja ja pöytäpeliä takia suosio räjähti, että alkoikin tulemaan inspiroituneita pelejä. Siis mä sanoisin, että Cthulhu-jutut on ollut UG ennen Dark Corners of the Earthia, koska Cthulhusta on tehty videopelejä ennen Dark Corners of the Earthia. Ja siis pöytäroolipeleissä Lovecraft-jutut on ollut oikeesti tosi iso juttu jo paljon pidempään ennen kuin just nimenomaan tämä Dark Corners of the Earth tuli ulos. Siis videopeleihin se ehkä toi Dark Corners saattoi aiheuttaa jotain, mutta en mä sanoisi, että se olisi niin kuin suoranaisesti Cthulhua mainstreamannut tää yksi videopeli.
Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then, suddenly, I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm sometime after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard pearls of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe.
Cthulhu ei ole koskaan ollut ihan todellista mainstreamia, ei. Siis en mä sano, että edes niinku Dark Corner... Mä en tiedä, miksi se Dark Corners of the Earth olisi, siis tietyissä piireissä ehkä, mutta en mä sano, että Cthulhu on edes sen jälkeen ollut mitenkään mainstreamia. Ei Lovecraft-mythos ole koskaan ollut. Se on aina ollut vähän semmosen niin kuin pienemmän klikin juttu. Just pöytäroolipelit, videopelit, tosi vähän elokuvia sun muit vastaavia, niin se on ollut aina vähän semmonen niin kuin pienempi juttu. Ja mä veikkaan, että se nimenomaan Call of Cthulhu-pelikin, niin ne videopelit ottaa hyvin paljon tosta sit pöytäropeista vaikutteita myös. Ja hei vaan Tsunderi! Lautapeli on kotoisin vuodelta 81. Sitten oli prototyyppiä konipelejä aiheesta, mutta ei mitään julkaistua. Aivan. No siis eihän se nyt herran jesta, se on mikään Cthulhuun liittyväkään. Mikään Lovecraftiin liittyväkään ei ole verrattavissa D&D. Ei millään tasolla. Ei mikään, mikä Lovecraftin asioista on tullut. Ehkä niinku Lovecraftin kirjat itsessään on verrattavissa D&Dn kuuluisuuteen, mutta siis kyllä D&D on niinku ihan kaikkea Cthulhu-mediaa tunnistettavampi. Joo, ja kyllä varmasti D&D:ssäkin on Lovecraftin jutuista otettu jotain vaikutteita. Jossain 10 vuotta sitten alkoi näkymään enemmän Cthulhu-aiheisia oheistuotteita. Niin. Sekin on vähän, kyllä mä sanon, että sä löydät niitä vuosien varrelta, jos sua kiinnostaa ne jutut, mut en mä ikinä pystyisi sanomaan, että mikään Cthulhuun liittyvä olisi sille ihan hirveästi mainstreamia. Onks Amnesia? No joo, okei, on Amnesia aika semmonen Lovecraft-vaikutteinen. Totta, kun siinä on se Outworld ja kaikki muut omituisuudet. The Journalist. Lovecraft was a prominent figure in the world of amateur journalism. In 1915, he started publishing his own journal called The Conservative, which included political and social commentary, poetry, short stories, and literary criticism written by him and other authors. Howard was a skilled wordsmith, but he also took criticism to heart, which resulted in his decision to step away from writing poetry and concentrate on the weird fiction again, for the first time since his teenage years. Dagon, published in 1919, is one of the short stories written during that period. In this example excerpt from The Conservative, the master of horror fiction explains his attitude towards warfare and the idea of world peace. Why any sane human being can believe in the possibility of universal peace is more than the conservative can fathom. Should the entire civilized world agree simultaneously to disarm, one or more nations would undoubtedly retain secret armaments and at the proper time take advantage of their other altruistic and less astute contemporaries, in a wild career of conquest against unarmed victims. No country is or ever can be above warfare, until the basic impulses of the human animal shall have miraculously changed. Agreeable, I would say. Cthulhu-jutut tuntuu olevan semi-mainstream kauhuteemahässäkkä. Onko? Niin paljon siihen nojaavia pelejä. Onko? Kirjaimellisesti meillä oli aikaisemmin vaikeuksia edes keksiä mitään niin kuin siihen loreen liittyvää. Onks niitä niin paljon? Kun mä sanon, että siis se, että sen täytyisi olla truly Lovecraftian, niin on aivan täysin eri asia kuin se, että ottaa minkä tahansa asian, joka vähänkin on sinne suuntaan, niin suoraan Lovecraftianisminä. Siis esimerkiksi tää saakeli, että Silent Hill on niinku Lovecraftin tarinat, koska Outworld ja monstereita. Psykologinen kauhu on oma juttuunsa. Silent Hillillä on aivan täysin oma juttuunsa. Mä en edes niinku kuvittelisi, että Silent Hill esimerkiksi olisi millään tavalla lainausmerkeissä Lovecraftianista kauhua, koska se ei ole. Siinä on demoneita, mutta sit vois sanoa, että se on kristillistä kauhua, koska kristinuskossa on demoneita. Silleen, että pelkästään se, että on joku semmonen paha superjumala jossakin, ei suoraan tarkoita sitä, että this is literally, you know, a copy-paste of Cthulhu. It's not the same thing. Siis jo Amnesia herätti paljon kiinnostusta kauhuun niihin aikoihin. Mä sanoisin, että Amnesia on tuonut ainakin tommosten semmoisten kauhupeliä, missä sä olet aika turvaton ja joudut enemmän juoksenteleen karkuja ja ratkaisen putsleja kuin oikeasti taisteleen. Amnesia toi niinku sen jutun mainstreamiksi, mut en mä silti sano, että Amnesia olisi hirveästi mainstreamannut Lovecraftia. Kaiken maailman Sinking Cityt, tosi niche-peli. Hyvin mixed reviews ja ei kovin tunnettu. Call of Cthulhu the Game, literally a fourth part of a game series that started, literally a fifth part of a game series that started like in the fucking 80s. Blades in the Dark pöytäroolipeli. Jälleen kerran se on pöytäroolipeleissä ollut aina enemmän prominent kuin videopeleissä. Koska siitä saa... En mä sano, että millä Cthulhu on mitenkään videopeleissä hirveästi esillä. Jos mä nyt revievaisin äkkiä päässäni edelliset 100 kauhupeliä, mitä mä olen pelannut, niin mä voin sanoa, että niistä niinku pois laskien tämä kuukausi. Jos mä laskisin 100 mun edellistä kauhupeliä, mitä mä oon pelannut, niin mä oon ihan täysin varma, että se prosentuaalinen määrä, mikä niistä on ollut lainausmerkeissä Lovecraftianista kauhua, on todella pieni. Kosminen kauhu Cthulhu mythologian ulkopuolella on kokenut silloin tällöin pientä nostetta, mutta Cthulhu itsessään ei ole koskaan ollut mainstreamia. Samaa mieltä. Mansion of Madness, never heard. Ja koska never heard, niin todennäköisesti pöytärope, ja koska pöytärope, niin se on hyvin... Pöytäropet ei ole mainstreamia, uskottelitte sitten itsellenne mitä hyvänsä. Mulla ei ole mitään pöytäropeja vastaan, mun mielestä ne on itse asiassa tosi mielenkiintoisia, mutta ne ei ole mainstreami. Ne on oma klassinsa, ne on oma niin kun, juttuunsa. Semmonen Cthulhu Mythos point and click visual novelli Setzerin grafiikoilla voisi olla muuten aika hyvä. Mut silloin se oma blood angle, mitä se ei koskaan aio tehdä, mutta aina kutittelee sillä.
Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god.
Dagon was the main deity of the Philistines, worshipped throughout the Middle East as the ancient god of fertility and crops. In Hebrew, the word Dagon was a common noun for grain. The rulers of Akkad, Mesopotamia, chose him as the patron saint of their war conquests. He also appeared as the judge of the dead in the Assyrian poem and an underworld prison warder in one of the Babylonian texts. He is often mistakenly taken for a fish god due to the wrong interpretation of his name, as in Hebrew the word dag means fish. In H.P. Lovecraft's works, Dagon is an underwater deity ruling over the deep ones, a humanoid race with fish traits that resides in the oceans. He is worshipped by a secret cult called the Esoteric Order of Dagon, eli EOD, kuten Sinking Cityssä on tullut monesti vastaan. Tässäkin on hyvä esimerkki siitä, että esimerkiksi Dagon selkeästi niin kun ei ole mikään Lovecraft-originaali. Lovecraft vaan adaptoi sen omiin tarinoihinsa. Et, you know. There's also that. Setserin piirtämä isotissinen Azathoth olisi jees. Ei muuta kuin pistät commissionia perille.
But soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries.
Mä en tunne hasturia, mutta ei tarvitse myöskään alkaa selittää. Kyllä mä uskon, että se on joku Lovecraft-juttu. August Derleth and the Cthulhu Mythos. August Derleth was an American writer and anthologist. He also befriended Lovecraft and published many of his works through his company, Arkham House. Although he greatly contributed to the popularization of the author's works after his death, he is surrounded by numerous controversies. One of his most questionable decisions involving introducing the good versus evil doctrine. Derleth was a devout Catholic to the Cthulhu mythos, which contrasted with Lovecraft's view of the world and his approach to cosmic horror. As a result, the author's works are often misunderstood and misrepresented in today's culture. It is also worth noting that Lovecraft was never really interested in creating a mythology, and the term Cthulhu mythos was coined by Derleth after the author left the mortal plane. Ja jos kuuntelitte yhtään, kun mä luin tuon äsken, tai jos luitte sen itse, niin tässä on hyvin niin kun, vahvaa niin kun, pointtien tekemistä tässä näin, että miten ja milloin ja miksi Cthulhu Mythos lainausmerkeissä on ottanut mainstream-asemaa tai lainausmerkeissä mainstream-asemaa, miten se on muuttunut vuosien varrella, miten selkeästi niin kuin kristillisyys tämän katolisuuden kautta on tullut osaksi sitä ja vähän niin kuin sekoittanut pakkaa ja kaikkea tällaista. Hastur on King in Yellow, okei. Okay. Alkujaan 1890-luvun tarinassa mainittu paimenien jumala. Aivan. Mut joo, kuten tuossa äsken niin kun selkeästi tuli esille, niin myöskään Cthulhu Mythos ei ole ihan sitä, mitä se oli alun alkaen nykypäivänä. Miksi me tultiin tähän? Tässä ei ole mitään, mitä mä voin klikata.
It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men.
Lovecraft on tobacco and alcohol. Lovecraft hated tobacco, even though he used to smoke when he was 12 in order to look and feel like an adult. In his correspondence with a friend, Reinhard Kleiner, he claims that he quit as soon as he started wearing long pants. He also had a very strong opinion about alcohol, as evidenced by his letter to Zelia Brown, dated 13th February 1928. As for the matter of drinking, I have never tasted intoxicating liquor and never intend to, having a strong aesthetic disgust at anything which blunts and or coerces the delicate natural equipoise of the evolved human intellect and imagination. Ihan hyvä toi stanssi alkoholia kohtaan mielestäni. Drinking excited my personal repugnance, hence I do not drink. Let the herd do what they will. I am rather in favor of the prohibition. The prohibition of any one antisocial force as well as of any other. Okei, en ehkä niin kun tätä kakkosparttia tästä näin allekirjoita, mutta toi ensimmäinen osa on aika on point. Source: The Spirit of Revision, Lovecraft's Letters to Zelia Brown, Reed Bishop, H.P. Lovecraft, Sean Branney and Andrew Lehman, S.T. Joshi. Voiko sanoa, että on olemassa OG Cthulhu-fanit ja uusia fanit, jotka tykkää enemmän Arkham-tyylisistä? En tiedä, onko niitä OG Cthulhu-faneja enää edes elossa. Onko tää joku Lovecraft-nippelitietopeli? Tää on Lovecraftin Dagon, niinku short story videopelinä, mutta sitten täällä on kaikkea tämmöstä nippelitietoa, mitä voi kollektaa.
Often, I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm. A mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man of war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down into their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it.
Mä olin ihan varma, että tämä jätkä oli hyppäämässä ikkunasta, niin kuin siinä alussa implikoitiin.
It shall not find me. God, that hand! The window! The window!
Well, I stand corrected. Niinhän se vaan meni, että se jätkä hyppäsi ulos. We hope you enjoyed immersing yourself in our little pool of cosmic horror. We would appreciate it if you took a moment to rate Dagon and check out our games and DLCs. Joo, minkähänmoisia noin muut DLCt on? Tai millaisia noin DLCt yleensäkin on? Tää base game meinaan on ilmanen. Aika vähän me löydettiin triviaa. Vaikka mäkin kattelin koko ajan ympärilleni. Tales of Herring Lake, mikä tää? Kalastuskauhupeli, hei, jes. Katsotaan mitä nää DLCta. The Eldritch Box DLC. Tätä pitää sisällänsä. Ebook of Dagon, ebook of Fishhead, audiobook of Dagon, official wallpapers. Okei, ei mitään ihmeellistä. Onko tässä mitään muuta DLC? Onko tässä mitään tarina DLCtä? Mikä on Little Glass Bottle? Se on mulla wishlistillä. By buying this DLC, you're helping us fund our future narrative projects. Mutta kun ei tätä voi edes ostaa. It's not out yet. Ja se ei tainnut olla mikään Lovecraft-peli, se kalastuspeli. Ja mulla on itselläkin Dagon tuolla hyllyssä, koska mulla on toi saakeli Lovecraftin kootut teokset. Okei, joo. Toinen Lovecraft-tarina tulossa. Joskus. Semmonen peli oli Dagon. Se oli ihan hassu. Palataan toinen peli. Aina tullaan hulluksi. Katsotaan tullaanko tämän pelin kanssa hulluksi. Sen nimi on TRIHAYWBFRFYH. Elikkä The Rapture is here and you will be forcibly removed from your home. Mutta paljon lyhyempi title on. TRIHAYWBFRFYH. The rapture is here and you will be forcibly removed from your home. Jumalauta, kodistani eivät vie. Katsotaan. Vie kuitin päälle, niin... Ominous music. Jos mä klikkaan tuota, viekö tää Wikisourceen? Ei vaan johonkin sivustoon, mikä ei ole näköjään olemassa enää. Nätti. Okay. The rapture is here and you will be forcibly removed from your home. Toi nimi on kyllä vähän semmonen. Toi lyhenne. Apua. Tulen hulluksi. Näen punaisia ikuisuuksia. Ai saakeli, mä vaan tipahdin tähän. Notta se on UFO. Ostan tuon domaini ja laitan sinne Cthulhu-pornoa. Nätti. Älkää rapturoiko minua vielä. Hyvä soundtrack. Saalaanko tuo 2010-luvun kummallisuus?
The natural leadership with which my uncle procured the instruments from the laboratories of Brown University and the Cranston Street Armory, and instinctively assembled direction of our venture, was a marvelous commentary on the potential vitality and resilience of the men of 81. Elihu Whipple had lived according to the hygienic laws he had preached as a physician, and but for what happened later would be here in full vigor today.
Intriguing. On, mä tykkään kanssa tästä soundtrackista.
Had I, in full hideous fact, been drawn back to a pre-human world of 150 million years ago, in those dark, baffling days of the amnesia? Had my present body been the vehicle of a frightful, alien consciousness from Paleogean gulfs of time? Had I, as the captive mind of those shambling horrors, indeed known that accursed city of stone in its primordial heyday, and wriggled down those familiar corridors in the lonesome shape of my captor? Were those tormenting dreams of more than 20 years ago the offspring of stark, monstrous memories?
Kyseenalainen äänenlaatu ja miksaus puheklipissä. Mä en tiedä, missä nämä on äänitetty ja millaisissa oloissa ja tälleen. Voi olla,
My
että
name
sillä on
is
tekemistä.
Nathaniel Wingate Peasley, and those who recall the newspaper tales of a generation back, or the letters and articles in psychological journals 6 or 7 years ago, will know who and what I am. The press was filled with the details of my strange amnesia in 1908 until 1913. It was on Thursday, May 14th, 1908, that the queer amnesia came. The thing was quite sudden, though later I realized that certain brief, glimmering visions of several hours previous, chaotic visions which disturbed me greatly because they are so unprecedented, must have formed premonitory symptoms. My head was aching, and I had a singular feeling, altogether new to me, that someone else was trying to get possession of my thoughts. The collapse occurred around 10:20 a.m. I slumped down unconscious in my chair, in a stupor from which no one could arouse me. Nor did my rightful faculties again look out upon the daylight of our normal world for 5 years, 4 months, and 13 days. It is of course from others that I have learned what followed.
I do not wish to answer this question.
At 3 a.m., May 15th, my eyes opened and I began to speak. But before long, the doctors and my family were thoroughly frightened by the trend of my expression and language. It was clear that I had no remembrance of my identity and my past, though for some reason I seemed anxious to conceal this lack of knowledge. My eyes gazed strangely at the persons around me, and the flexions of my facial muscles were altogether unfamiliar. Even my speech seemed awkward and foreign. I used my vocal organs clumsily and gropingly, and my diction had a curiously stilted quality, as if I had laboriously learned the English language from books. The pronunciation was barbarously alien, whilst the idiom seemed to include both scraps of curious anachronism and expressions of a wholly incomprehensible cast.
The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday, the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light and into the peace and safety of a new dark age. I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor too intended to keep silent regarding the part that he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1927, with the death of my granduncle, George Gamble Angle, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angle was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions, and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may have been recalled by many. As my granduncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Engel bearing a singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and he called himself psychically hypersensitive. The sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics on the bas-relief. He said, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or the garden-girdled Babylon."
West of Arkham, the hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically, and where thin brooklets trickle without ever having caught the glint of sunlight. On the gentler slopes there are farms, ancient and rocky, with squat moss-coated cottages brooding eternally over old New England secrets in the lee of great ledges. But these are vacant now, the wide chimneys crumbling and the shingled sides bulging perilously beneath low gambrel roofs. The old folk have gone away, and foreigners do not like to live here. French Canadians have tried it, Italians have tried it, the Poles have come and departed. It is not because of anything that can be seen or heard or handled, but because of something that is imagined. The place is not good for the imagination. It does not bring restful dreams at night. It must be this which keeps the foreigners away, for old Ammy Peace has never told them of anything he recalls from the strange days. When I went into the hills and vales to survey for the new reservoir, they told me the place was evil.
Mä oon aika varma, että mä näin täällä sellaisen keltaisen paalun. Kuinka paljon mä oon juossut ohitte. Koitan päästä korkeammalle, että näkisin. Tässä ei tosiaan ihan hirveästi pysty hidastaa. Juoda mä varmaan kerkeen tässä samalla. Yhdellä kädellä pystyn pelaamaan. Jarruta nyt saatana, ei pysty! Gotta go fast! Nyt ollaan niin saatanan kefast. Juokse poika, juokse!
What I heard in my youth about the shunned house was merely that people died there in alarmingly great numbers. That, I was told, was why the original owners had moved out some 20 years after building the place. It was plainly unhealthy, perhaps because of the dampness and fungus growth in the cellar, the general sickish smell, the drafts of the hallway, or the quality of the well and pump water.
Tuo lause hämmentää mua. Devajan kaverit laitettu lukemaan tekstit, varmaan.
It was then that he began that rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the
how did
fevered
I miss
interest
that?
of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities, of titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice. A chaotic sensation which only fancy would transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters.
The essence was always the same. A person of keen thoughtfulness, seized with a strange secondary life, and leading for a greater or lesser period, an utterly alien existence typified at first by vocal and bodily awkwardness, and later by a wholesale acquisition of scientific, historic, artistic, and anthropological knowledge. An acquisition carried on with a feverish zest and with a wholly abnormal absorptive power. Then a sudden return of the rightful consciousness, intermittently plagued ever after with vague, unplaceable dreams, suggesting fragments of some hideous memory elaborately blotted out.
Average people in society and business, New
What the
England's
fuck is happening
traditional
here?
salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result. Though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more affected. It was from the artists and the poets that the pertinent answers came. I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was lacking in the original letters, I have suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions, or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see.
Monoliitteja kaikkialle.
I come now to the crucial and most difficult part of my narrative. All the more difficult because I cannot be quite certain of its reality. At times I feel uncomfortably sure that I was not dreaming or deluded, and it is this feeling, in view of the stupendous implications which the objective truth of my experience would raise, which impels me to make this record.
Mikä on stereoliitti? Onko se... Miten monoliitista tehdään stereoliitti? Antakaa do-it-yourself-ohjeet tähän näin.
Primal
DIY-ohjeet.
myth and modern delusion join in their assumption that mankind is the only one, perhaps the least, of the highly evolved and dominant races of this planet's long and largely unknown career. Things of inconceivable shape, they implied, had reared towers to the sky and delved into every secret of nature, before the first amphibian forebear of man had crawled out of the hot sea 300 million years ago. Some had come down from the stars, a few were as old as the cosmos itself, and others had arisen swiftly from terrene germs as far behind the first germs of our life cycle, as those germs are behind ourselves. Spans of thousands of millions of years and linkages to other galaxies and universes were freely spoken of. Indeed, there is no such thing as time in its humanly accepted sense.
Riittäisikö 2 monoliittia vierekkäin? Miksei?
But most of the tales and impressions concern a relatively late race, of a queer and intricate shape, resembling no life form known to science, which had lived till only 50 million years before the advent of man. This, they indicated, was the greatest race of all, because it alone had conquered the secret of time. It had learned all things that ever were known, or ever would be known on the earth, through the power of its keener minds to project themselves into the past and future, even through gulfs of millions of years, and study the lore of every age. From the accomplishments of this race arose all legends of prophets, including those in human mythology.
Tää tyyppi alkaa aina heilu
With this
kummallisesti, kun
eon
salama iskee.
embracing knowledge, the great race chose from every era and life form such thoughts, arts, and processes as might suit its own nature and situation. Knowledge of the past, secured through a kind of mind casting outside the recognized senses, was harder to glean than knowledge of the future. In the latter case, the course was easier and more material. With suitable mechanical aid, mind would project itself forward in time, feeling its dim, extrasensory way until it approached the desired period. Then, after preliminary trials, it would seize on the best discoverable representative of the highest of that period's life forms. It would enter the organism's brain and set up therein its own vibrations, while the displaced mind would strike back to the period of the displacer, remaining in the latter's body till a reverse process was set up. The projected mind, in the body of the organism of the future, would then pose as a member of the race whose outward form it wore, learning as quickly as possible all that could be learned from the chosen age and its massed information and techniques. Meanwhile, the displaced mind, thrown back to the displacer's aging body, would be drained of all its knowledge by trained questioners.
Are you done?
In short, it seemed to my uncle and me that an incontrovertible array of facts pointed to some lingering influence in the shunned house, traceable to one or another of the ill-favored French settlers of 2 centuries before, and still operative through rare and unknown laws of atomic and electronic motion. That the family had possessed an abnormal affinity for outer circles of entity, dark spheres which for normal folk held only repulsion and terror, their recorded history seemed to prove.
Olisiko tässä pitänyt seurata niinku tiettyyn väreihin?
To declare that we were not nervous on that rainy night of watching would be an exaggeration both gross and ridiculous. We were not, as I have said, in any sense childishly superstitious, but scientific study and reflection had taught us that the known universe of 3 dimensions embraces the merest fraction of the whole cosmos of substance and energy. In this case, an overwhelming preponderance of evidence from numerous authentic sources pointed to the tenacious existence of certain forces of great power, and, so far as the human point of view is concerned, exceptional malignancy.
Kun mä vähän niinku kadotin noita värejä aina jatkuvasti, että mä löysin läheltä eri värejä.
Such a thing was surely not a physical or biochemical impossibility in the light of newer science, which includes the theories of relativity and intra-atomic action. One might easily imagine an alien nucleus of substance or energy, formless or otherwise, kept alive by imperceptible or immaterial subtractions from the life force or bodily tissues and fluids of other and more palpably living things into which it penetrates and with whose fabric it sometimes completely merges itself. It might be actively hostile, or it might be dictated merely by blind motives of self-preservation. In any case, such a monster must, of necessity, be in our scheme of things an anomaly, and an intruder whose extirpation forms a primary duty with every man, not an enemy to the world's life, health, and sanity. What baffled us was our utter ignorance of the aspect in which we might encounter the thing. No sane person had ever seen it, and few had ever felt it definitively. It might be pure energy, a form ethereal and outside the realm of substance, or it might be partially material, some unknown and unequivocal mass of plasticity, capable of changing at will to nebulous approximations of the solid, liquid, gaseous, or tenuously unparticled states. The anthropomorphic patch of mold on the floor, the form of the yellowish vapor, and the curvature of the tree roots in some of the old tales all argued at least a remote and reminiscent connection with the human shape. But how
Miksi se vaan katkes? Is the rapture here? Am I going to be forcibly removed? Miksi indie-devaajat rakastaa niin paljon omaa proosaa? Vai onko se vaan helppo tapa saada kontsaa peliin? Mun mielestä tää oli mielenkiintoinen. Mun mielestä tää oli omassa outoudessaan ja niinkun... For what it was. Ensinnäkin tää oli ilmanen. Ja toisekseen... Tää oli mielenkiintoinen. Mun mielestä tää oli ihan hyvä. I actually liked this. Pitää ehkä pelata tää silleen paremmalla ajalla, että ehtis lukemaan. No tossahan lukee, ei tää oo omaa proosaa. Katsos. Tässä on 4 eri Lovecraftin tarinaa, jotka on narratoitu. Rupeeko speedrunaamaan? Ei tätä voi speedrunaa, koska tää on toi 20 minuutin peli. Tässä on siis... Tää peli käynnistyy, niin tässä on 20 minuutin timeri. Sen jälkeen you will be forcibly removed. Mut joo, tää oli ihan täsmälleen sama kuin toi Dagon. Tää oli niinku vaan narratoituja Lovecraft-tarinoita. 4 eri. Me voidaan... No en tiedä. Koitetaan... Hetkinen. Jos mä klikkaan tota. Minkä se vie mut? Täällä on oikein IMDb-sivu. Niitä. Eli siis jos me etsitään täältä joku tietty narratiivi, niin me voidaan seurata jotain Lovecraft story. Joo, siis totta kai ne oli narration vetäneen sivuja. Sehän luki siellä se nimi. Onks teillä ihan hirveästi viivettä? Onks tässä tullut joku tosi pitkä viive jostain syystä?
The natural leadership with which my uncle procured the instruments from the laboratories of Brown University and the Cranston Street Armory, and instinctively assembled direction of our venture, was a marvelous commentary on the potential vitality and resilience of a man of 81. Elihu Whipple had lived according to the hygienic laws he had preached as a physician, and but for what happened later would be here in full vigor today.
Mikä se naisen kertova tarina nu oli? Mikä tää niistä Lovecraft-storeista on?
What I heard in my youth about the shunned house was merely that people died there in alarmingly great numbers. That, I was told, was why the original owners had moved out some 20 years after building the place. It was plainly unhealthy, perhaps because of the dampness and fungus growth in the cellar, the general sickish smell, the drafts of the hallway, or the quality of the well and pump water.
Ei kun mä vaan ajattelin, kun toi narratio... Mä vaan ajattelin, kun toi kysymys tuli silleen niin kun... Sen verran sen jälkeen, kun mä olin käynyt kattoo se IMDb-sivu, mä ajattelin, että oliko se tullut sitä ennen se kysymys ja... Striimi vaan on hidasta jotain.
In short, it seemed to my uncle and me that an incontrovertible array of facts pointed to some lingering influence in the shunned house, traceable to one or another of the ill-favored French settlers of 2 centuries before, and still operative through rare and unknown laws of atomic and electronic motion. That the family had possessed an abnormal affinity for outer circles of entity, dark spheres which for normal folk held only repulsion and terror, their recorded history seemed to prove. To declare that we were not nervous on that rainy night of watching would be an exaggeration both gross and ridiculous. We were not, as I have said, in any sense childishly superstitious, but scientific study and reflection had taught us that the known universe of 3 dimensions embraces the merest fraction of the whole cosmos of substance and energy. In this case, an overwhelming preponderance of evidence from numerous authentic sources pointed to the tenacious existence of certain forces of great power, and, so far as the human point of view is concerned, exceptional malignancy. Such a thing was surely not a physical or biochemical impossibility in the light of newer science, which includes the theories of relativity and intra-atomic action. One might easily imagine an alien nucleus of substance or energy, formless or otherwise kept alive by imperceptible or immaterial subtractions from the life force or bodily tissues and fluids of other and more palpably living things into which it penetrates and with whose fabric it sometimes completely merges itself. It might be actively hostile, or it might be dictated merely by blind motives of self-preservation. In any case, such a monster must, of necessity, be in our scheme of things an anomaly, and an intruder whose extirpation forms a primary duty with every man, not an enemy to the world's life, health, and sanity.
Tämä on Shandhouse, okei, no niin.
What baffled us was our utter ignorance of the aspect in which we might encounter the thing. No sane person had ever seen it, and few had ever felt it definitively. It might be pure energy, a form ethereal and outside the realm of substance, or it might be partially material, some unknown and unequivocal mass of plasticity, capable of changing at will to nebulous approximations of the solid, liquid, gaseous, or tenuously unparticled states. The anthropomorphic patch of mold on the floor, the form of the yellowish vapor, and the curvature of the tree roots in some of the old tales all argued at least a remote and reminiscent connection with the human shape. But how
Miksi toi katkee toi narratiivi? Toi katkee aina tossa kohdassa.
It occurred to us too that our venture was far from safe, for in what strength the thing might appear no one could tell. But we deemed the game worth the hazard and embarked on it alone and unhesitatingly, conscious that the seeking of outside aid would only expose us to ridicule and perhaps defeat our entire purpose. Such was our frame of mind as we talked, far into the night, till my uncle's growing drowsiness made me remind him to lie down for his 2-hour sleep.
Julkaisi Lovecraftin kuoleman jälkeen tää tarina, okei.
He had, he said, floated off from a very ordinary series of dream pictures into a scene whose strangeness was related to nothing he had ever read. It was of this world and yet not of it, a shadowy, geometrical confusion in which could be seen elements of familiar things in most unfamiliar and perturbing combinations. There was a suggestion of queerly disordered pictures superimposed one upon another, an arrangement in which the essentials of time as well as of space seemed dissolved and mixed in the most illogical fashion. In this kaleidoscopic vortex of phantasmal images were occasional snapshots, if one might use the term, of singular clearness but unaccountable heterogeneity.
Heterogeenisyyttä.
I felt in my visions a cosmic and abysmal loneness, with hostility surging from all sides upon some prison where I lay confined. I seemed bound and gagged and taunted by the echoing yells of distant multitudes who thirsted for my blood. My uncle's face came to me with less pleasant associations than in waking hours, and I recall my futile struggles and attempts to scream. It was this which clove through the barriers of dream and flung me to a sharp and startled awakeness, in which every actual object before my eyes stood out with more than natural clearness and reality. Above the anthropomorphic patch of mold by the fireplace it rose, a subtle, sickish, and luminous vapor which, as it hung trembling in the dampness, seemed to develop vague and shocking suggestions of form, gradually trailing off into nebulous decay and passing up into the black great chimney with a fader in its wake. It was truly horrible, and the more so to me because of what I know of the spot. Refusing to flee, I watched it fade, and as I watched, I felt that it was in turn watching me greedily with eyes more imaginable than visible.
En tiedä, onko public domainia nämä Lovecraftin storit, ja jos ei ole, niin ihan ymmärrettävää, ettei käytä koko lorea. Ja vaikka olisikin, niin ehkä se on ihan silleen vaan niinku pelin pituuden kannalta, että se ei ole sitä 20 minuuttia pidempi.
On my ears rang the reverberations of that shocking scream, while my nostrils revolted at the stench which filled the place. My mind, as alert as my sense, recognized the gravely unusual, and almost automatically I leaped up and turned about to grasp the destructive instruments which we had left trained on the moldy spot before the fireplace. As I turned, I dreaded what I was to see, for the scream had been in my uncle's voice, and I knew not against what menace I should have to defend him and myself.
Kaikkien tarinoiden oleva public domainia. Okei, no siinä tapauksessa mä vähän veikkaan, että se on ihan vaan pelillisistä syistä. Että niinku 20 minuuttia on just sopiva mitta. Että ei oo mikään semmonen saakeli 3,5 tunnin narraatio. Ja ennen mitään argumentaatiota siitä, että no mutta miksi sitten tehdä koko peliä ollenkaan, niin voi vaan antaa vasta-argumentin, että no miksi pelata koko peliä, when you can read it. I don't know, because it exists.
Yet after all, the sight was worse than I had dreaded. There are horrors beyond horrors, and this was one of those nuclei of all dreamable hideousness, which the cosmos saves to blast an accursed and unhappy few. Out of the fungus-ridden earth steamed up a vaporous corpse-light, yellow and diseased, which bubbled and lapped to a gigantic height in vague outlines half human and half monstrous, through which I could see the chimney and fireplace beyond. It was all eyes, wolfish and mocking, and the rugose insect-like head dissolved at the top to a thin stream of mist. I say I saw this thing, but it is only in conscious retrospection that I ever definitively trace its damnable approach to form. At the time, it was only to me a seething, dimly phosphorescent cloud of fungus loathsomeness, enveloping and dissolving to an abhorrent plasticity, the one object to which all my attention was focused. That object was my uncle, the venerable Elihu Whipple, who with blackening and decaying features leered and gibbered at me and reached out dripping claws to rend me in fury which the horror had brought.
Lähipiiri luopui oikeuksista Lovecraftin tuttavalle, joka sitten halusi mahdollisimman monen lukevan niitä, joten käytännössä vaan lui public domaini. Aivan.
In that dim blend of blue and yellow, the form of my uncle had commenced a nauseous liquefaction whose essence eludes all description, and in which there played across his vanishing face such changes of identity as only madness can conceive. He was at once a devil and multitude, a charnel house and a pageant, lit by the mixed and uncertain beams. That gelatinous face assumed a dozen, a score, 100 aspects, grinning as it sank to the ground on a body that melted like tallow in the caricatured likeness of Legion Strange and yet not strange.
Mielenkiintoista. Jokaisen näiden tarinoiden aikana niin nämä asiat, mitä tänne maailmaan mäjähtelee, niin on erilaisia. Hauskaa. Tavallaan lisää uudelleenpeluarvoa.
The rest shadowy and monstrous. There was no one in all the world I dare tell. grey dawn unfolded wetly from the east, silhouetting the archaic hill, beckoning me to the place where my terrible work was still unfinished. My mind was made up, and taking my hat I set out for home, where I bathed, ate, and gave by telephone an order for pickaxe, a spade, a military gas mask, and 6 carboys of sulfuric acid, all to be delivered the next morning at the cellar door of the shunned house. At 11 a.m. the next day I commenced digging. It was sunny weather, and I was glad of that. I was still alone, for as much as I feared the unknown horror I sought, there was more fear in the thought of telling anybody. My hand shook perceptibly, but still I delved. After a while, standing in the large hole I had made. With the deepening of the hole, which was about 6 feet square, the evil smell increased, and I lost all doubt of my imminent contact with the hellish things whose emanations had cursed the house for over a century and a half. I wondered what it would look like, what its form and substance would be, and how big it might have waxed through the long ages of life's sucking. Suddenly my spade struck something softer than earth. I shuddered and made a motion as if to climb out of the hole, which was now as deep as my neck.
Onks tää niinku se shunned house, koska nää johtaa aina takaisin tähän?
The surface I uncovered was fishy and glassy, a kind of semi-putrid congealed jelly with suggestions of translucency. I scraped further and saw that it had form. There was a rift where part of the substance was folded over. The exposed area was huge and roughly cylindrical, like a mammoth blue-white stovepipe, doubled in 2, its largest part some 2 feet in diameter. Still more I scraped, and then abruptly I leaped out of the hole and away from the filthy thing, frantically unstopping and tilting the heavy carboys and precipitating their corrosive content, one after another, down the charnel gulf and upon the unthinkable abnormality whose titan elbow I had seen. The 2 remaining carboys I emptied down without particular result, and after a time I felt it safe to shovel the earth back into the pit. It was twilight before I was done, but fear had gone out of the place. The dampness was less faded, and all the strange fungi had withered to a kind of harmless greyish powder, which blew ash-like along the floor. One of Earth's nethermost terrors had perished forever, and if there be a hell, it had received at last the demon soul of an unhallowed thing. And as I patted down the last spadeful of mold, I shed the first of many tears with which I have paid unaffected tribute to my beloved uncle's memory.
Oliks toi nyt niinku tossa toi tarina? Mä vähän veikkaan, että tähän 20 minuuttia saa hyvin mahtuun 2 näitä. Kuinka kauan me ollaan pelattu tätä? Suurin piirtein? Nyt niinku tää uusi runi. Onks tää nyt se speedrun? Joo, mä en näe ainakaan uusia tarinapisteitä. Tää on kyllä villi tää soundtrack tässä. No, mulla ei oo yhtään hajua, että kuinka kauan tää on kestänyt tää toinen runi. Kerkeekö tässä kuuntelee vielä yhden tarinan?
The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday, the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light and into the peace and safety of a new dark age. I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor too intended to keep silent regarding the part that he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him.
Mikäs tää tarina oli?
My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1927, with the death of my granduncle, George Gamble Angle,
Tältäkin on kuullut
Professor
unkeli.
Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angle was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions, and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may have been recalled by many. As my granduncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Angle bearing a singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and he called himself psychically hypersensitive. The sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics on the bas-relief. He said, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities. And dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or the garden girl of Babylon."
Musta tuntuu, että tätä tarinaa ei ehditä kuulee loppuun. Nyt alkoi näkymään nämä keltaiset pallurat.
It was then that he began that rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities, of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice. A chaotic sensation which only fancy would transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters.
Tää on ollut Call of Cthulhu. Okei. No sit me ei todellakaan varmaan ehditä lukemaan tätä. Musta vähän tuntuu, että tää on näistä storeista pisin.
Average people in society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result. Though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more affected. It was from the artists and the poets that the pertinent answers came. I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was lacking in the original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had lately resolved to see.
Joo, tää on varmaan tehty silleen, että yksi tarina per läpipelu. Siinä on vähän ekstra aikaa sitten, jos eksyy. This work is in the public domain in the United States because it was legally published in the United States jotain lakijuttuja before 1964 and copyright was not renewed. Okei, aivan. Joo, tässä on 4 storia, eli periaatteessa 4 läpipeluta. No, mun mielestä on ihan hauska tämmönen lyhennetty narratiivikokoelma lievällä interaktiivisuudella Lovecraftin tarinoista. I think this is a fine video game. Derleth ja Vandrei tappeli tarinoiden oikeuksista ja nykyään ajatellaan, että heillä ole oikeasti mitään oikeuksia tarinoihin. Kun ei tiedetty kuka oikeasti omisti tarinat, niin kukaan ei legitisti uusinut sitä vaaditussa ajassa. Joo. Okei. No, siinä oli vähän niinku tämän päivän Cthulhu-narratiivit. Saatiin 2 kokonaistarinaa läpi, Dagon ja sitten toi mikä house se oli? Shunt House. Hei Marsu. Tulit juuri radikaalisti paikan päälle katsomaan, kun mä lopetan striimin. Tää oli tässä. Me kuuntelimme Lovecraftin kauniita tarinoita ja päätämme sekoilun tähän. R.H. Barlow, jonka Lovecraft itse valitsi, ehti tehdä itsari ennen kuin tuo aikaraja edes liian ajankohtaiseksi. Okei, ouch. Joo. Tällaista se välillä on. Ei kai siinä. Mutta joo. Mun pitää nyt lähteä ajelemaan autolla toisaalle poispäin, niin minä kiitän teitä kaikkia katsomisesta tai oikeastaan tässä vaiheessa enimmäkseen kuuntelusta. Ja me palaamme taas maanantaina uppoavan kaupungin parissa. Ei ole tosiaan enempää demoja nyt enää, niin nyt maanantaitkin on ihan vaan perus gaming days, joten nähdään silloin. Hei hei!